She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, she would have heard footsteps. What she heard was the specific silence of someone who knew how to move through a building without announcing themselves. Sloane Mercer had spent 15 years interviewing people who operated in that silence. Intelligence contractors, fixers, the category of person whose entire professional value lived in the gap between what was documented and what was done. She didn't reach for her phone. She reached for the external hard drive on her desk and pulled it from the port in one practiced motion, dropping it into the inside pocket of her jacket before she turned around. The man in her doorway was watching her do it. He didn't smile. He didn't apologize for the hour or explain how he'd gotten past a door with a 6-digit code she'd changed 4 days ago. He simply stepped inside, set a single manila folder on the edge of her desk without opening it, and sat down in the chair across from her as though she'd invited him. "Sloane Mercer," he said, not a greeting, more like a file being opened. "You have about 45 seconds, she said, "before I call the kind of people who make other people disappear from security footage." "You don't have those people anymore." His voice was even unhurried. "Hartwell burned your network in March. Chen's cooperation agreement was signed in April, and the encrypted channel you used with your State Department contact went dark 6 weeks ago when they reassigned him to Brussels." He paused. "You've been operating without a safety net for 2 months. You know it. They know it. That's why the filing is happening now and not 6 months ago." Sloane did not move. This was the thing about being genuinely dangerous information. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a diagnosis. She looked at him properly for the first time. Gabriel Thorne. She had a name before she had a face because she'd heard the name in 3 separate conversations over the past year, always peripheral, always attached to outcomes that couldn't be fully explained by the visible facts. Political fixer. The kind of man who existed in the margin between official versions of events. Late 40s. Nothing soft about him. Eyes that were doing the same thing hers were doing, cataloging, measuring, deciding. "Talk," she said. He talked. It took 11 minutes. She timed it unconsciously, the way she timed everything. He laid out the contractor network's legal mechanism, a fabricated evidence package that would trigger a Treasury Department investigation into her nonprofit's offshore account structures. The accounts were clean. That was irrelevant. The investigation itself would freeze her operating funds, expose her source protection architecture to subpoena, and give the network 90 days to identify every name in her system before a single charge was formally filed. The filing date was 48 hours away. There is one legal instrument that protects your nonprofit's financial architecture from Treasury subpoena under the 1978 Privacy of Partnership Assets Act, he said. It requires the primary signatory of the nonprofit to be legally married to a citizen with active diplomatic immunity status at the time of the filing. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "You have diplomatic immunity status," Sloane said. "Residual, from a consultancy role with the Danish Trade Mission. It expires in 8 months." He reached forward and opened the manila folder. Inside was a single document, clean, legal, prepared by someone who knew what they were doing. 6 months of legal marriage, on paper. No overlap with your personal life beyond what's required for the filing to hold. After 6 months, you file for dissolution, and the network's legal mechanism has no standing. Sloane looked at the document without touching it. She had interviewed enough dangerous people to know that the most dangerous ones never needed to raise their voice. They simply presented you with the mathematics of your situation until the variables pointed in one direction. "How do you know my door code?" she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a reaction, the ghost of one. "The same way I know everything else I've told you tonight." He closed the folder, stood, buttoned his jacket with the same unhurried precision he'd brought to everything else. "You have 24 hours. Verify what I've told you. You'll find it's accurate." He was at the door. "Mr. Thorne." He stopped but didn't turn fully. "You said the filing is happening now because they know I'm exposed." She kept her voice level. "So how do you know I'm exposed? That's not public information." He turned then, and something in his expression told her this was the question he'd been waiting for, the one that confirmed she was exactly who he needed her to be. "You'll find everything checks out," he said quietly. "What you won't find is why I really chose you." The door closed without a sound. Sloane stood in her office for 4 seconds. She timed that too. Then she sat down, opened her encrypted laptop, and began to verify every single thing he'd said. She already knew it would all be true. That was what frightened her most. Some of us have spent our lives protecting other people's stories, learning every tactic, every pressure point, every way that powerful people silence dangerous women. We became experts in other people's vulnerabilities while convincing ourselves we had none. But there is a particular kind of exposure that no amount of professional armor prepares you for, not the threat you can document, the person you cannot fully read. The one who walks into your most guarded space and somehow already knows the cost of everything inside it. She worked through the night the way she always had, methodically, without coffee, without music, without anything that might soften her focus. First, the contractor network. 3 shell companies, 2 of them registered in Delaware, 1 in the Cayman Islands, all 3 connected through a lobbying firm called Arctis Group, whose public-facing work was unremarkable and whose private contracts, when you knew where to look, told a different story. The fabricated evidence package was real. She found its fingerprints in a sealed court filing from a parallel case in Virginia. The same legal architecture, used twice before against 2 other nonprofits. Both had folded within 90 days. She sat with that for a moment, then kept going. The Privacy of Partnership Assets Act, 1978, obscure enough that most attorneys wouldn't cite it without prompting. She pulled the statute, read it twice, found the specific clause he'd referenced. It was exactly what he said it was. She checked case law. It had held in 2 federal challenges. Gabriel Thorne. She built his file the way she'd built files on people for 15 years, public records first, then the gaps, then what the gaps told her. Consultant, fixer, no criminal record, 3 addresses in the past decade, none held longer than 2 years. A brief Senate ethics inquiry 6 years ago, sealed before conclusion. Former clients who wouldn't comment, former colleagues who didn't return calls. The kind of professional footprint that was too clean in exactly the places that mattered. Then she found the sister. Mara Thorne, 34 years old at time of death, junior analyst at the Department of Energy, had testified before a federal subcommittee on contractor misconduct. She noted the committee, noted the date, noted which contractors had been named. 17 months after her testimony, a car accident on a rural Virginia road on a clear night with no weather event, no mechanical fault identified, no other vehicles involved. Ruled accidental. Sloane stared at the name for a long time. She wrote it in her notebook, physical, encrypted by handwriting only she could read, and drew a single line connecting it to Arctis Group. Then she called her board member, Thomas, at 4 a.m. without apology. He was the only person whose judgment she trusted completely and who had enough legal background to wargame options honestly. They talked for 40 minutes. At the end, Thomas said, "Sloane, I've looked at this from every angle. There's no cleaner instrument, not in 48 hours." She already knew that. She hung up, sat in the silence of her office, looked at the manila folder still on the corner of her desk, still closed, still waiting. Then she picked up her phone and dialed. He answered on the first ring. Of course he did. Terms, she said. A pause, brief, controlled. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She looked at the clock. It was 5:04 a.m. His office was 35 minutes away. He was already close. He had never stopped watching the building. She said nothing about this. She put the phone down and opened the folder. He sat across from her at her kitchen table like he'd sat across from heads of state, back straight, hands visible, giving nothing away for free. She had made no coffee. This wasn't that kind of meeting. I'll go first, Sloane said, and opened her notebook. Her terms were not a list. They were a legal architecture, separate residences for the duration, any shared appearances documented in advance and mutually approved. No communication through channels she hadn't personally verified as clean. No actions affecting her nonprofit's operations, personnel, or sources without 48 hours written notice. Full transparency on any active case that intersected with her work. Gabriel listened without interrupting. Mutual destruction clause, she continued. If either of us acts against the other's interests, the arrangement voids immediately. Both parties release documented proof of the other's involvement in the marriage filing. Agreed. Too fast, she noted it. I want access to your current active files. He didn't move. That can be arranged. She waited. With one exception, he said. One file remains outside the arrangement. Which file? One that isn't relevant to your nonprofit or the contractor network. She looked at him. He returned it without flinching. Two people who had both learned that the first person to fill a silence usually lost something. The clause stands regardless, she said finally. Agreed. She slid the document across the table. He read it fully. She'd expected him to skim, noted that he didn't, then signed on the indicated line and returned it without ceremony. She signed beneath his name. For approximately 4 seconds, the only sound was the pen being recapped. Then Gabriel reached into his jacket and placed a second document on the table, a notarized copy of his diplomatic immunity certification. Valid, current, everything he'd claimed. She picked it up, examined it, set it down. The filing has to be submitted by tomorrow at noon, he said, standing. I know when it has to be submitted. He nodded once, moved toward the door, then stopped at the threshold. Something she was beginning to recognize as a habit, leaving in stages, as though calculating what to withhold until the last possible moment. The file I excluded, he said, his back still partially to her. You'll look for it. Yes. You won't find it. I'll find something. He almost smiled, not quite. Good night, Ms. Mercer. The door closed. Sloane sat at the table for 2 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and began searching for the excluded file. He was right. It didn't exist in any system she could access. Professionally removed, deliberately erased, which meant it had existed, which meant someone had spent real resources making it disappear. She wrote 4 words in her notebook. Find it, then decide. The fundraiser occupied 3 floors of a Georgetown hotel and smelled like old money and newer ambition. Gabriel had briefed her in the car with the efficient tone of someone running an operational rehearsal. Stay west of the main entrance. Engage the Meridian Group table briefly, move on. Don't initiate contact with anyone from the Arctis donor list. If approached, defer to him. Sloane had listened attentively. She intended to follow perhaps half of it. They entered together, his hand at the small of her back, light, professional. the gesture of a man who understood that performance required physical specificity. She matched his pace, angled her body toward him at the precise degree that read as coupled without reading as performance. She'd done undercover work early in her journalism career. She knew how to inhabit a role. What she hadn't accounted for was how naturally it settled. She filed that observation away and kept moving. 40 minutes in, she spotted him. Richard Carr, mid-50s, senior VP at Arctis Group. She'd memorized his face from 3 photographs, 2 of them grainy. He stood near the bar alone for exactly the kind of moment that only presented itself once. She made her decision in approximately 2 seconds. "Sloane," Gabriel said quietly behind her. She was already moving. She approached Carr with the relaxed confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she stood. Introduced herself with her real name. People trusted real names more than aliases. And then mentioned Gabriel, gesturing back toward him, calling him her husband with the casual ease of someone who had said that word 1,000 times before. Carr's expression shifted, barely, 1 degree of recalibration behind his eyes. Something had been confirmed for him in that exchange, though she couldn't yet identify what. He recovered smoothly, said the appropriate things, and moved away within 3 minutes. Sloane returned to Gabriel's side. He said nothing until they reached the car. "You were supposed to stay near the west wall." "You're welcome," she said. "He recognized your name." "I know. That wasn't in the brief." "No," she looked out the window. "It was better than the brief." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him revising something in his assessment of her. She understood that feeling. She was doing the same with him. They drove the rest of the way in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the most honest thing that had happened between them yet. Back at her apartment, she opened her laptop to wind down and found a notification in her nonprofit's secure server portal. New message. Anonymous routing. Received at 9:47 p.m. while they were at the fundraiser. She opened it. 3 pages, formatted like an internal report. At the top, a file reference number she didn't recognize. The file Gabriel said didn't exist. Someone had just sent her the first 3 pages. She placed the 3 pages on the table between them without preamble. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he sat down, slowly, the way people sit when they're buying themselves time to decide how much truth the moment requires. "How much do you know?" he said, not a question. "Mara Thorne," Sloane said, 34, Department of Energy analyst, testified before the Hargrove subcommittee. 17 months later, a Virginia road, clear night, no other vehicles. She paused. "The contractors she named in that testimony are the same network coming after my nonprofit." Gabriel said nothing. "The file is yours," she continued. 3 years of it. You've been building a case nobody will officially touch because the network has enough reach to keep it buried." She watched his face. "You didn't choose me because of the marriage filing mechanism. You chose me because my nonprofit holds testimony from someone who was in the room when your sister was discredited." The silence that followed was the specific kind that confirmed everything. "Yes," he said. 1 word. Flat. The affect of someone who had learned to deliver difficult truths without inflection, because inflection cost too much. Sloane felt her anger arrive clean and certain. She had been chosen instrumentally. Selected, positioned, moved like a piece with a specific function. She knew this feeling. It had happened before, earlier in her career, and it had cost her a source and 6 months of work and a degree of trust in her own judgment she'd never fully recovered. "Talk," she said, the same word she'd used the night he walked into her office. Different weight entirely. He talked. He told her about Mara without the flat affect this time. It came through anyway, not in his voice but in the specific details he chose. The particular way his sister laughed when she was nervous. How she'd called him the night before her testimony asking whether she was doing the right thing. How he'd told her yes without hesitation. How he'd been telling himself for 3 years that the answer was still yes, and finding it harder each time. Sloane listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't speak immediately. She looked at the 3 pages between them, then at the man across from her, and performed the journalist's calculation she'd been running since the night he walked in, threat, asset, or something the categories didn't cleanly cover. Somewhere in the last 4 weeks, Gabriel said quietly, the distinction between protecting you and caring what happens to you stopped being something I could track. He looked directly at her. I don't know what to do with that. Sloane absorbed this. Nothing changes, she said. The arrangement continues. The source stays protected. She stood and walked to her room. Inside, she opened her encrypted notebook and wrote one line. Find the rest of the file before he does, then decide. She placed the 3 pages on the table between them without preamble. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he sat down, slowly, the way people sit when they're buying themselves time to decide how much truth the moment requires. How much do you know? He said, not a question. Mara Thorne, Sloane said, 34, Department of Energy analyst, testified before the Hargrove subcommittee. 17 months later, a Virginia road, clear night, no other vehicles. She paused. The contractors she named in that testimony are the same network coming after my nonprofit. Gabriel said nothing. The file is yours, she continued. 3 years of it. You've been building a case nobody will officially touch because the network has enough reach to keep it buried. She watched his face. You didn't choose me because of the marriage filing mechanism. You chose me because my nonprofit holds testimony from someone who was in the room when your sister was discredited. The silence that followed was the specific kind that confirmed everything. Yes, he said. One word. Flat. The affect of someone who had learned to deliver difficult truths without inflection, because inflection cost too much. Sloane felt her anger arrive clean and certain. She had been chosen instrumentally. Selected, positioned, moved like a piece with a specific function. She knew this feeling. It had happened before, earlier in her career, and it had cost her a source and 6 months of work and a degree of trust in her own judgment she'd never fully recovered. Talk, she said, the same word she'd used the night he walked into her office. Different weight entirely. He talked. He told her about Mara without the flat affect this time. It came through anyway, not in his voice but in the specific details he chose. The particular way his sister laughed when she was nervous. How she'd called him the night before her testimony asking whether she was doing the right thing. How he'd told her yes without hesitation. How he'd been telling himself for 3 years that the answer was still yes, and finding it harder each time. Sloane listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't speak immediately. She looked at the 3 pages between them, then at the man across from her, and performed the journalist's calculation she'd been running since the night he walked in, threat, asset, or something the categories didn't cleanly cover. Somewhere in the last 4 weeks, Gabriel said quietly, the distinction between protecting you and caring what happens to you stopped being something I could track. He looked directly at her. I don't know what to do with that. Sloane absorbed this. Nothing changes, she said. The arrangement continues. The source stays protected. She stood and walked to her room. Inside, she opened her encrypted notebook and wrote one line. Find the rest of the file before he does, then decide. David Paris was smaller than his file suggested. Sloane didn't know why she expected otherwise, sources always were. Fear compressed people. She'd learned that early and never stopped noticing it. He was mid-40s, a government analyst who'd spent 18 years being precisely unremarkable, which was probably what had kept him alive. He sat at the safe house table with both hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, watching the door with the specific vigilance of someone who had recently discovered that the place they felt safest was no longer safe. They had 40 minutes before the transport window. They found the secondary address, he told Sloane. The one I'd had for 2 years. Nobody had that address. Someone did, Gabriel said from the far side of the room. David looked at him briefly, then back at Sloane. He'd agreed to this meeting on her name alone. Gabriel's presence in the room was something he was tolerating, not welcoming. "Tell me what you need," Sloane said. David told her. It came out haltingly, the account of someone who had been rehearsing a confession for years without ever finding the right audience. He'd been present peripherally during the Hargrove subcommittee proceedings, not testifying, administrating, routing documents, managing schedules, sitting in rooms he was expected not to remember. He remembered everything. He described the specific session where Mara Thorne's credibility had been systematically dismantled, not through counter-evidence, but through coordinated character questioning. Documents that appeared from nowhere. Witnesses who contradicted her timeline with precision that felt rehearsed. A subcommittee member who asked questions that could only have been written by someone with access to Mara's private communications. Sloane was writing. She felt rather than saw Gabriel go still across the room. David had documentation. Physical copies, stored separately from any government system, held for 2 years while he decided whether the cost of coming forward was one he could pay. Being found at the secondary address had made the decision for him. "I'll testify," he said, "but I need her in the room." He looked at Sloane. "Not lawyers, not him, you." "The network will know you're coming," Gabriel said from across the room. His voice was controlled. "Sloane becomes the most visible target in the building." "I know," Sloane said. "I'm not asking your permission," she added. She looked at David. His hands had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 10 minutes. She noted that, the way people steadied when they finally said the true thing out loud to someone capable of carrying it. "Yes," she told him, "I'll be there." Gabriel said nothing further. On the drive back, he stared at the road with the expression of a man doing difficult arithmetic. She had felt his hand on her arm briefly in the safe house. Her hand, her doing, withdrawn before either of them could acknowledge it. She didn't explain it. Neither did he. He arrived at 9 p.m. without calling ahead. She opened the door because she'd heard the elevator. She always heard the elevator, and had spent the 40 seconds between that sound and the knock deciding whether to answer. She answered. Gabriel stood in the hallway holding nothing except a flash drive, which he held out to her without greeting. She took it, turned it over once. "Everything," he said. "Full case, no withheld pages." She stepped back from the door. He came inside. She plugged the drive into her air-gapped laptop and opened the file directory while he stood near the window looking at the city below with his back to her. She scrolled slowly. 3 years of documented evidence, witness accounts, financial trails, internal communications, the full corroborated record of everything the network had done and everything that had been done to Mara. It was meticulous. It was devastating. It was exactly the kind of file that should have moved mountains and hadn't, because the people positioned to move mountains had been carefully selected not to. "Why tonight?" she said. He turned from the window. "Because you walk into that hearing in 9 hours, and I needed you to go in knowing there's no version of this where I'm still using you." Sloane set the laptop aside. This was the part of the conversation she'd been managing toward for 6 weeks, keeping it theoretical, keeping it professional, keeping it in the category of information to be processed rather than felt. She was extraordinarily good at that. It was, she had been told more than once, not entirely a compliment. "Somewhere between the safe house and tonight," she said carefully, "you became someone I can't file under a clean category." "I know," Gabriel said. "I stopped being able to file you cleanly around week 2. That's inconvenient." "Extremely." He crossed the room and stood close enough that the professional distance they'd maintained for 6 weeks became an active choice rather than a default. She looked at him the way she looked at documents she wasn't sure she trusted, completely, without concession. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair from her face. One careful movement. She didn't step back. Her phone detonated on the table. They both looked at it. Threat update notification, her nonprofit security system, the alert she'd configured to wake her from any depth of sleep. She picked it up. "Read it." "Set it down." "They've filed a motion," she said. Her voice had returned to its operational register as though the last 60 seconds hadn't happened. "To have me removed from the hearing room. They're citing our marriage as evidence of a coordinated political operation." Gabriel was already thinking. She could see it. "If the motion holds, David won't testify," she said. "I know. We have one move." "I know that too." She looked at him. 9 hours, one move. Everything she'd built, everything Mara Thorne had paid for, balanced on tomorrow morning. "Tell me," she said. The motion failed at 8:47 a.m. 13 minutes before the hearing opened. Gabriel had spent the night working a single contact inside the committee's legal office, someone who owed him nothing except the truth, which turned out to be enough. The motion was procedurally defective, filed too late, dismissed without prejudice. Sloane received the notification while standing in a courthouse bathroom looking at her reflection. She put her phone away and walked into the hearing room. It was smaller than televised proceedings suggested. Cameras compressed space, inflated ceilings, made everything look more monumental than it felt from inside. What it actually felt like was a room full of people who had decided the outcome before anyone sat down, and one woman who intended to rearrange that decision methodically and without raising her voice. She found her seat, arranged her documents, did not look for Gabriel in the public gallery. The contractor's lawyer moved within the first 4 minutes. His name was Sutter, precise, silver-haired, the specific brand of confident that came from decades of making inconvenient people disappear from proceedings before the inconvenient part arrived. He addressed the committee with practiced concern. The marriage, he explained, represented a coordinated scheme. He produced documents, time-stamped, notarized, appearing irrefutable, suggesting Sloane's nonprofit had funneled operating funds through Gabriel's diplomatic accounts in the 18 months preceding the filing. The implication was elegant. She hadn't been protecting whistleblowers. She'd been laundering the investigation itself. The committee chairman leaned forward. Sloane let Sutter finish. This was the thing about people who relied on fabricated documents. They built their entire architecture on the assumption that the target would respond to the attack rather than wait for it to complete. She had learned this lesson covering a corruption trial in her 2nd year as a journalist and had never forgotten it. She opened her folder. The real marriage documents first. Time-stamped, notarized, filed through the courthouse's own system, predating every document Sutter had cited by 22 days. She passed copies to the committee without commentary and watched Sutter's expression recalibrate. Then David. He testified for 19 minutes, quietly, specifically, with the particular credibility of someone who had been carrying documented evidence for 2 years and was finally in a room with the legal authority to receive it. He named dates, named rooms, named the subcommittee member who had asked questions written by someone with access to Mara Thorne's private communications. The room's energy shifted the way rooms shifted when something irreversible had just been said aloud. Then Sloane opened the second folder. The red file, reconstructed, complete, every page corroborated by David's testimony and 3 years of Gabriel's evidence, rebuilt from the partial pages she'd received and the fragments she'd spent 6 weeks quietly assembling. She began to read. Across the room, Richard Carr's face moved through recognition, then calculation, then the specific stillness of someone who understood they had lost. The chairman called a recess. Sloane walked into the corridor. Gabriel stood against the far wall. He hadn't come inside, he'd watched through the public feed on his phone, she realized. He looked at her without speaking. "You burned your copy," she said. "Yes. I rebuilt it." "I know," a pause. "I was counting on it." She looked at him. "Was that the last thing you were counting on me for?" He opened his mouth. The recess ended. The clerk's voice carried through the open doors. She had to go back in. 3 weeks passed the way the aftermath of difficult things always passed, loudly for everyone else, quietly for the person at the center. 2 federal indictments. The contractor network's operating accounts frozen pending investigation. Arctis Group's lobbying registration suspended. David was relocated successfully, his new name and address known only to Sloane and one federal marshal she trusted without reservation. Her nonprofit's funding was restored on a Tuesday. She sat at her desk and looked at the confirmation email for a long time without feeling what she'd expected to feel. She and Gabriel had not spoken since the corridor. Not by accident, by the specific mutual understanding of 2 people who recognized that the conversation waiting for them required more stillness than either had managed to find yet. She was reviewing grant applications on a Thursday afternoon when the letter arrived. Physical mail, handwritten address, postmarked from a city she didn't recognize, which meant it wasn't the city the sender actually lived in. She opened it carefully. The first page was from a woman named Caroline Marsh. 4 years ago, Sloane had spent 11 weeks building a protection structure around Caroline's testimony against a pharmaceutical lobbying group. The case had settled. Caroline had disappeared into a new life, which was exactly the intended outcome. Sloane hadn't heard from her since. "You taught me that the truth is always worth the cost," Caroline wrote. "I didn't know you were paying it too. I watched the hearing coverage from somewhere I won't name. I want you to know that whatever it cost you, it mattered. It still matters. I'm still here because you decided I was worth protecting." Sloane set the page down. The second page was in different handwriting. Older. The pen pressure uneven in the way of someone writing under physical stress or emotional weight or both. At the top, in careful letters, "For whoever finally brings this forward, please make sure they receive this." Mara Thorne had written it 7 days before the Virginia Road. 2 paragraphs. Sloane read them twice, then a third time, then sat with them in the specific silence that followed encounters with someone's last deliberate words. Mara had known the risk, had chosen it anyway, had written this letter not in despair but in the clear-eyed certainty that the truth she was carrying was larger than what happened to her personally. The second paragraph was not about the case at all. It was about her brother, what she hoped for him, what she wanted him to understand about why she'd testified despite his fear for her. Tell him the answer was still yes, she'd written. It was always yes. Sloane closed her eyes. She sat in her office as the afternoon light moved across the floor. Then she picked up her phone. Put it down. Picked it up again. Looked at Gabriel's name for a long moment. One chapter left, one conversation overdue. She put the phone in her pocket and reached for her jacket. She took the stairs. Not because the elevator was slow, but because she needed the 12 floors to decide exactly what she was walking toward. By the 4th floor she knew it wasn't closure. By the 8th she knew it wasn't answers. By the 12th she knew it was simply this. She was done letting the distance be easier than the alternative. Gabriel opened the door before she knocked. He'd heard the stairwell door. Of course he had. He stepped back without speaking, and she came inside. His apartment was dark except for the city light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The same light she imagined had kept him company through 3 years of a case that no one would officially touch, and one paper marriage that had quietly become something neither of them had filed for. She didn't sit down, neither did he. I read the letter, she said, both of them. Something moved through his face, the closest thing to unguarded she had seen from him in 6 months. Caroline found a way to reach me, Sloane continued. Mara's letter was with hers. She paused. She said to tell you the answer was still yes, that it was always yes. Gabriel turned toward the window. She gave him 40 seconds. She counted, not from habit this time, but from the specific tenderness of knowing this man needed 40 seconds and choosing to give them without making it a transaction. When he turned back, his expression had settled into something she didn't have a professional category for. She was beginning to think that was the point. There's one thing I didn't tell you, he said. She waited. 3 years ago, before the network, before the filing. He looked directly at her. I read a piece you wrote, long form, about a source you'd protected for 2 years who ultimately chose not to testify. You wrote about what that cost you professionally, personally. Most journalists would have made themselves the story. You made it about what courage actually looks like when it doesn't have a clean ending. He paused. That's why I chose you. Before I knew about your nonprofit, before I knew about the source who could corroborate Mara's case. He held her gaze. The rest came later, but that was first. Sloane absorbed this. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. The paper marriage expires in 6 weeks, she said finally. I know. I'm not interested in renewing the paper version. The city hummed quietly beyond the glass. Gabriel looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent 3 years being precise about everything and was now, carefully and without rehearsal, choosing to be uncertain. There's a question I don't know the answer to yet, she said. Whether I'm someone who can be known completely and not reduce it to a story I'm telling myself about trust. She held his gaze. I don't know yet. I want to find out. That's enough, he said quietly. That's more than enough. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Not touching. Present. The city below them, indifferent and bright and full of people making the same calculation, whether the cost of being known was one they could afford. Later she would think about what Mara had written in that second paragraph. Not about the case, about her brother, what she'd hoped for him. She hadn't told Gabriel what the second paragraph said. Not yet. Some things deserved their own moment, their own stillness, their own version of 12 flights of stairs taken one at a time before you knew what you were walking toward. She would tell him. Just not tonight. Some of us have spent our lives protecting other people's stories while keeping our own behind locked doors we called professionalism. We convinced ourselves that self-protection and strength were the same thing. Sloane Mercer taught herself every way that trust could be weaponized, and then met someone who burned 3 years of his own justice rather than weaponize hers. She didn't stop being guarded. She just finally understood that the right person doesn't ask you to take the walls down. They simply make you want to open the door. The truth is always worth the cost. Mara Thorne knew it. Now so does Sloane.